Have you ever made a choice that destroyed you from the inside out, and convinced yourself it was the only way? Look, I'm not talking about some everyday decision here. I'm talking about those gut-wrenching moments where you looked at an impossible situation and thought, someone's gotta take the fall, and I guess that someone is me. You know what I'm saying? That moment when you realized the people you love would suffer no matter what, and you specifically, decided to absorb all that pain so they wouldn't have to. And here's the kicker. You didn't tell anyone. You just carried it, silently. Like it was your job, your responsibility, your burden to bear. Here's what trips me out about this whole thing. Somewhere along the way we got sold this idea that sacrifice equals love. That if you're not bleeding for someone, if you're not destroying yourself for the greater good, then you're not really committed. You're not really devoted. And honestly, that's some toxic stuff right there. But we buy into it anyway because it feels noble, doesn't it? It feels right to be the one who suffers so others don't have to. Like you're some kind of martyr walking through life collecting everyone else's pain. But let me ask you something real quick. Have you ever stopped to think about what that does to you? Like actually think about it? Because here's what nobody talks about. When you make yourself responsible for outcomes you can't control, when you take on guilt that isn't even yours to carry, you're not just being selfless. You're erasing yourself. You're telling yourself that your pain doesn't matter as much as theirs. That your mental health, your peace, your existence is somehow less valuable. And the craziest part? Most people who do this never feel like they had a choice. They look back and say, what else could I have done? As if the universe handed them this impossible situation and said, figure it out, champ. No guidance, no support, just this overwhelming weight pressing down on your chest while everyone around you stays blissfully unaware of the war you're fighting in your own head. Stay with me until the end because what I'm about to break down is gonna hit different. We're diving deep into the psychology of why smart, capable, deeply caring people end up trapped in these cycles of silent suffering. Why they protect everyone except themselves. And more importantly, how that pattern gets wired into your brain so early that by the time you're an adult, you don't even question it anymore. You just accept it as your role. See, there's this thing that happens when you grow up believing that your worth is tied to how much you can endure. You start seeking out situations where you can prove yourself through sacrifice. It becomes your identity. I'm the strong one. I'm the one who handles it. I'm the one who doesn't break. And everyone around you? They start depending on that version of you. They need you to be that person. So you keep playing the part even when it's killing you inside. You already passed through this, haven't you? Maybe not in the exact same way, but you felt it. That suffocating feeling of being trapped between impossible choices, where every option leads to pain and you're just trying to pick the version where you hurt the most so everyone else hurts a little less. What you're about to discover might actually shift how you see yourself and every selfless choice you've ever made. Because here's the uncomfortable truth we need to talk about. That suffocating feeling of being trapped between impossible choices, where every option leads to pain and you're just trying to pick the version where you hurt the most so everyone else hurts a little less. What you're about to discover might actually shift how you see yourself and every selfless choice you've ever made. Because here's the uncomfortable truth we need to talk about. But real quick, if what I just said hit home, if you felt that in your chest, do me a solid and smash that like button right now. Here's why that actually matters. This channel doesn't do surface level content. We're not here for entertainment fluff. We use stories and characters as psychological mirrors to dissect the human conflicts most people never put into words. The stuff that keeps you up at 3 a.m. questioning everything. And honestly, the algorithm buries content like this unless you actively support it. So if this type of deep, real conversation is what you need more of, hit subscribe. That tells me, and YouTube, that there's actually an audience for raw, honest breakdowns of why we do the things that hurt us. It's a fair exchange. I keep bringing this energy, you keep showing up. Simple as that. Now back to what we were getting into, because this is where it gets real uncomfortable. There's this pattern that shows up across cultures, across generations, across completely different life situations, and it always looks the same. Someone young, someone capable, someone with way too much awareness for their age, gets put in a position where they have to make a call that no one else wants to make. And here's the thing, they don't just make the decision. They absorb the entire emotional aftermath. They become the container for everyone else's potential suffering. They turn themselves into a psychological shield and then they just live with it. In silence. Forever. Let me paint you a picture of what this actually looks like. Imagine someone who, at a critically young age, sees a situation spiraling toward catastrophe. They see the people they love caught in the middle of something way bigger than any individual can handle. Systems are failing, authority figures are frozen or corrupt, and the clock is ticking. Everyone's looking around waiting for someone else to step up, but no one does. So this person, this kid really looks at the chaos and makes a calculation. A cold, brutal calculation that says, if I do this terrible thing right now, I can prevent something even worse from happening later. And they commit to it, fully. They don't hesitate, they don't second guess in the moment, they just execute the plan and carry the weight of what that choice means for the rest of their existence. This is where Itachi Uchiha becomes more than just a character in a story. He becomes a psychological mirror for a specific type of trauma that a lot of us carry but never name. See, Itachi was 13 years old when he was given an impossible directive. Eliminate an entire group of people who were planning a coup that would lead to civil war and potentially destroy everything. And I know what you're thinking. That's anime logic, that's fiction, that doesn't apply to real life. But strip away the fantasy elements and look at the core psychology. You've got a kid who's intellectually advanced, emotionally isolated, and conditioned to believe that his value comes from his ability to protect others at any cost. Sound familiar? Here's what makes Itachi's situation so psychologically potent. He didn't just make the decision and move on. He engineered his own villain arc. He made sure everyone hated him, made sure his little brother would see him as a monster, made sure he would die being remembered as a traitor and a murderer. What? Because in his mind that was the kindest outcome. If people hated him, they wouldn't question the narrative. If his brother hated him, his brother would have a clear enemy to overcome and grow stronger fighting against. Itachi turned himself into a psychological tool for other people's development while erasing his own humanity in the process. And here's the part that's gonna mess with your head. This isn't noble. It's not heroic. It's a trauma response. It's what happens when someone grows up in an environment where their emotional needs are never prioritized, where they're praised for being mature and responsible while still being a child, where they learn that love is conditional on how useful they can be. Itachi was groomed, not in the predatory sense but in the systemic sense, to believe that his purpose was to suffer for the greater good. And once that belief gets embedded, it becomes your entire identity. Think about how this plays out in real life. You've got the oldest sibling who raises their younger brothers and sisters because the parents are absent or overwhelmed. You've got the employee who takes on everyone else's workload because someone has to do it. You've got the friend who's always available for everyone else's crises but never asks for help with their own. These people aren't just being kind. They're operating from a deeply ingrained belief that their value is tied to how much they can endure without breaking. And the scariest part? Society rewards this. We call them strong. We call them selfless. We hold them up as examples while they're quietly deteriorating inside. What Itachi represents is the ultimate expression of this mindset taken to its logical extreme. He didn't just sacrifice his happiness, he sacrificed his identity, his reputation, his right to be understood. He chose to be misunderstood forever because he believed that was the price of protection. And for years he lived with that. He watched his brother grow up hating him, calling him a monster, swearing revenge. And Itachi never defended himself, never explained, never asked for empathy or understanding. He just carried it. Now here's where the psychology gets really twisted. Itachi didn't see himself as a victim. He saw himself as a tool. He made a distinction in his own mind between Itachi the person and Itachi the function. And once you split yourself like that, once you decide that your personhood is less important than your utility, you stop advocating for yourself entirely. You stop believing you deserve rest or peace, or even basic acknowledgement of your pain. You just exist in this state of perpetual sacrifice, waiting for the moment when your usefulness runs out and you can finally stop. Does that sound extreme? Because I'm telling you right now, there are people reading this who just felt that in their soul. People who've been operating as functions instead of humans for so long they forgot there was supposed to be a difference. People who've made themselves so available, so reliable, so strong, that everyone around them has forgotten they're capable of breaking too. The thing about Itachi's choice that makes it so psychologically complex is this. He genuinely believed there was no other option. And that's the trap. When you're in the middle of an impossible situation, when emotions are high and consequences are severe and time is limited, your brain goes into survival mode. It narrows your focus. It makes you think in binaries, either this or that, save them or lose everything, act now or regret it forever. And in that state, nuance disappears. Alternative solutions disappear. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, you don't have to be the one to carry this, that disappears too. But here's what nobody tells you about those moments. The choice to sacrifice yourself is still a choice. It might feel like the only option, but it's not. It's the option that you've been conditioned to see as most acceptable because it aligns with your pre-existing belief that your pain matters less than other people's comfort. And once you make that choice, once you step into that role, it becomes incredibly difficult to step back out of it. Because now people depend on that version of you. Now the narrative is set. Now you're the strong one, the selfless one, the one who handles it. And if you suddenly stop being that person, everything falls apart. So you keep going. You keep carrying it. You keep telling yourself it was the right call, that you'd make the same choice again, that this is just who you are. But deep down, in those quiet moments at 3 a.m. when you can't sleep because your mind won't shut off, you wonder. You wonder what your life would have looked like if someone else had stepped up. You wonder if anyone even notices how much you're holding. You wonder if the people you protected would still love you if they knew the real cost of their safety. That's the weight Itachi carried. Not just the guilt of what he did, but the loneliness of never being able to share why he did it. And that isolation. That's what destroys people. Not the hard choices themselves, but the silence that comes after. The inability to be seen, to be understood, to have someone look at you and say, I see what you did, I see why you did it, and I see that it's been tearing you apart. Comment there, I've carried weight in silence. Let me know if this is hitting home for you, because we're about to go even deeper into why this pattern exists and what it actually takes to break free from it. Now, I want to go even deeper into why this pattern becomes so ingrained that people can't escape it even when they want to. Because here's the thing, what we're really talking about here is something psychologists call toxic responsibility. And no, that's not some trendy buzzword. It's a legitimate psychological trap where you start believing that you're accountable for outcomes you have zero control over. You take ownership of other people's feelings, other people's choices, other people's entire emotional landscapes. And once that belief sets in, it rewires how you move through the world. Think about how Itachi operated after making his choice. He didn't just accept responsibility for stopping the coup. He took responsibility for his brother's emotional development, for the village's stability, for maintaining a lie that required him to play a role for years. He became a one-man system holding everything together through sheer force of will and self-denial. And here's what's wild. He never questioned whether that was sustainable. He never asked himself, wait, should one person really be carrying all of this? He just accepted it as his burden because somewhere deep in his conditioning, he'd learned that his needs didn't matter as much as the collective outcome. This is where it connects to real life in ways that are honestly uncomfortable to acknowledge. Toxic responsibility doesn't start with one massive decision. It starts small. It starts with being the kid who always mediates when your parents fight. It starts with being the employee who stays late because the team needs me. It starts with being the friend who drops everything when someone's in crisis, even if you're barely holding it together yourself. Each time you do this, you're reinforcing a neural pathway that says, my value comes from my utility. My worth is measured by how much I can handle without complaining. And here's the trap within the trap. People start to depend on this version of you. They get comfortable with you being the strong one, the reliable one, the one who never asks for help. And if you suddenly try to change that dynamic, if you try to say, actually, I can't do this anymore, or, I need support too, you're met with confusion, disappointment, sometimes even anger. Because you've trained everyone around you to see you as inexhaustible. You've become a function in their lives, not a person with limits. What makes this especially damaging is something called sacrificial compulsion. It's not just that you're willing to sacrifice, it's that you feel compelled to. Like you physically can't stop yourself from taking on more than you should. It's almost addictive in a weird way. Because every time you sacrifice yourself and things work out okay for others, you get this hit of validation. You get proof that you're valuable, that you matter, that you're doing the right thing. But that validation is conditional. It only exists as long as you keep sacrificing. The moment you stop, the moment you prioritize yourself, that validation disappears and you're left wondering if people ever cared about you or just what you could do for them. Itachi lived this reality in its most extreme form. His entire relationship with his brother was built on a lie that required continuous self-sacrifice. He had to keep playing the villain, keep pushing Sasuke away, keep reinforcing this narrative that he was a monster worth hating. And every interaction was probably torture for him. Imagine loving someone that deeply and having to act like you don't. Imagine wanting to explain yourself, to be understood, to have one genuine moment of connection, and knowing you never can because the truth would unravel everything you sacrificed for. That's what emotional repression at this level does to a person. It doesn't just hide your feelings, it fundamentally alters your relationship with your own inner experience. You stop trusting your emotions because emotions feel dangerous. They threaten the role you're playing. So you shut them down. You compartmentalize. You create this internal hierarchy where the mission, the responsibility, the outcome, all of that matters more than what you're feeling. And over time you lose access to yourself. You become so good at suppressing your own needs that you genuinely forget you have any. Here's where the psychology gets really dark. When your identity becomes entirely built around guilt and responsibility, you start seeking out situations that reinforce that identity. It's like you've got this internal script that says, I am the person who carries impossible burdens, and your brain actively looks for opportunities to prove that script correct. You don't consciously choose this, it happens subconsciously. You end up in relationships where you're always the caretaker. You end up in jobs where you're perpetually overwhelmed. You end up in dynamics where you're the one everyone leans on while you've got nobody to lean on yourself. And the wildest part? You might actually resist situations where you're not needed in that way. Because if you're not the person carrying the weight, who are you? If you're not suffering for others, what's your purpose? Your entire sense of self has become so intertwined with sacrifice that the idea of not sacrificing feels like losing your identity altogether. This is what happened to Itachi psychologically. He couldn't separate Itachi the person from Itachi the protector who must suffer in silence. His identity was the weight he carried. And even if someone had offered him a way out, even if circumstances had changed and he could have stopped playing the villain, I genuinely don't think he would have known how. Because the transformation required to go from that level of self-denial back to having personhood, back to believing you deserve peace and understanding, that's not a simple switch you flip. That's deep psychological work that requires you to question everything you've built your sense of self around. Let me break down what's happening in the brain when this pattern gets established. Your prefrontal cortex, which handles decision-making and self-regulation, basically gets hijacked by your limbic system's fear response. Every time you think about not taking responsibility, about letting someone else handle it, about prioritizing yourself, your brain triggers an anxiety response. Feels wrong. Feels selfish. Feels like you're abandoning people. So you override your own needs and step back into the familiar role of the person who handles everything. But here's the devastating truth nobody talks about. You can't actually save anyone by destroying yourself. You can't create genuine peace through your own suffering. You can't build healthy relationships while you're operating from a place of complete self-denial. What you create instead is a house of cards that requires your constant sacrifice to stay standing. And the moment you can't sacrifice anymore, whether because you're burned out, sick, or just finally done, everything collapses anyway. All that suffering, all that silent endurance, all those years of carrying weight that wasn't yours, and in the end, it doesn't actually prevent the pain you were trying to avoid. It just postpones it while destroying you in the process. This is the hidden cost that people like Itachi don't calculate when they make their initial choice. They see the immediate crisis and they think, if I do this, I can fix it. But they don't see the decades of psychological damage that comes from living a lie. They don't see the way that kind of repression eats away at your ability to connect authentically with anyone. They don't see how loneliness becomes your default state because you can never let anyone close enough to see the truth. And here's what really gets me about this whole pattern: the people you're protecting? They often don't want you to sacrifice yourself like this. If they knew the full cost, if they understood what you were giving up, a lot of them would say, please don't do this for me. But you never give them that choice because you've already decided that you know what's best. You've taken their agency away while convincing yourself you're being selfless. And that right there is where martyrdom crosses the line into something more complicated, something that's less about love and more about control masked as sacrifice. Itachi never asked Sasuke what he wanted. He made a decision about his brother's entire life trajectory without input. He engineered this elaborate plan for Sasuke's development based on what Itachi thought was necessary, not on what Sasuke actually needed. And yeah, maybe he was right about some of it. Maybe things worked out in certain ways. But the emotional devastation, the years of hatred and confusion, the complete destruction of trust, was that really worth it? Or was there another path that Itachi couldn't see because he was so locked into his martyrdom mindset? These are the questions that reveal the uncomfortable truth beneath the surface of noble sacrifice. Sometimes what looks like selflessness is actually fear. Fear of being vulnerable. Fear of sharing the burden and having people see you as weak or incapable. Fear of losing control of the narrative. And when you're operating from that place of fear while calling it duty, you end up creating exactly the kind of pain you were trying to prevent, just in a different form. Comment there, I recognize this pattern in myself. Because what I'm about to reveal next is going to completely shift how you understand not just Itachi's choice, but every impossible decision you've ever made thinking there was no other way. Now, here's where things get really uncomfortable, and I need you to stay with me because this is the part most people don't want to hear. That belief you carry, That conviction that says, I had no choice, might not be the truth. It might be a defense mechanism. A psychological shield you constructed to protect yourself from something even more terrifying than the impossible decision itself. The reality that you chose this. That somewhere in your mind, you saw multiple paths forward and you selected the one that required you to suffer because suffering felt safer than the alternative. I know that sounds backwards. How could suffering ever feel safer? But think about it like this. When you make yourself the martyr, when you take on all the pain and responsibility, you're actually maintaining control. You're the one deciding who gets hurt and how much. You're orchestrating the outcome. But if you were to share that burden, if you were to ask for help or admit you can't handle it alone, now you're vulnerable. Now you're at the mercy of other people's capabilities and choices. Now you have to trust, and trust means risk, and risk means potentially facing an outcome you couldn't prevent. For someone like Itachi, who grew up in an environment where trust was conditional and betrayal was always a possibility, the idea of relying on anyone else probably felt more dangerous than just handling everything himself. So he convinced himself, genuinely convinced himself, that there was no other option. That narrative wasn't just something he told others. It was something he needed to believe to justify the path he chose. Because if he admitted there might have been alternatives, if he acknowledged that maybe he could have reached out to someone, trusted someone, shared the burden, then he'd have to face the possibility that all that suffering was preventable. And that realization? That would destroy him more completely than the guilt of what he actually did. This is the hidden truth behind most acts of extreme self-sacrifice. They're not always about saving others. Sometimes they're about saving yourself from the vulnerability of needing others. They're about maintaining the illusion of control in a chaotic situation where you actually have very little. And once you make that choice, once you step into that role, you have to keep telling yourself it was the only way. Because if it wasn't, if there were other options you couldn't see because of your own psychological blind spots, then what does that say about all the years you spent suffering? What does it say about the relationships you destroyed and the life you gave up? Let me tell you what happens psychologically when you live like this for years. You develop what's called learned helplessness, but in reverse. Instead of believing you can't change anything, you believe you're the only one who can change anything. You become hyper-responsible, pathologically self-reliant, fundamentally unable to delegate or trust. And this doesn't just affect the big decisions. It seeps into everything. You can't enjoy moments of peace because you're always scanning for the next crisis you'll need to manage. You can't form authentic connections because you're constantly performing the role of the person who has it all together. You can't be vulnerable because vulnerability would shatter the entire identity you've built around being the strong one who never breaks. Itachi lived this reality so completely that he didn't even have a self outside of his mission. Think about it, what did Itachi want? What were his dreams, his desires, his personal aspirations? We don't know because he didn't have any. He erased those parts of himself so thoroughly that when people remember him, they remember his sacrifice, his duty, his role, but not him as a person. He became a symbol, an idea, a cautionary tale about the cost of noble intentions. But the actual human being underneath all that? He disappeared long before his body did. And here's the devastating part. That disappearance, that erasure of self, it doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual. Every time you choose the mission over your own needs, every time you suppress an emotion because it's inconvenient to the role you're playing, every time you perform strength while you're crumbling inside, you're shaving off a little piece of your authentic self. And you don't notice it happening until one day you look in the mirror and realize you don't recognize the person staring back. You've become so good at being what everyone needs that you've completely lost track of who you actually are. This is the price of sacrificial identity that nobody warns you about. It's not just that you suffer, it's that you stop existing as a complete human being. You become a function, a tool, a resource that other people tap into without ever having to see the cost. And the loneliest part? You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely isolated because nobody knows the real you. They only know the version you've constructed for them. The version that's always okay, always capable, always ready to carry more weight. For Itachi, this meant spending years around his brother without ever being able to have a genuine interaction. Every word was calculated, every action was part of the performance, every moment together was contaminated by the lie he was maintaining. Imagine the psychological toll of that. Imagine having the person you love most in the world right there in front of you, and you can't be real with them. You have to keep hurting them, keep pushing them away, keep playing a role that goes against every instinct you have, all because you decided years ago that this was necessary and now you're too deep to turn back. That right there is the trap within the trap. Once you've sacrificed this much, once you've paid this high a price, the idea of it all being for nothing becomes unbearable. So you double down. You convince yourself it was worth it. You find meaning in the suffering because the alternative, acknowledging that maybe you made a mistake, maybe there was a better way, maybe you destroyed yourself for nothing, that's too painful to even consider. So you commit harder to the narrative. You become even more rigid in your martyrdom. And the cycle perpetuates itself until you literally can't stop even if you want to. This is where the psychology of sunk cost fallacy intersects with trauma bonding and identity formation in ways that create an almost inescapable pattern. You've invested so much pain, so much time, so much of your essential self, that walking away feels like admitting it was all meaningless. And humans will do almost anything to avoid that conclusion. We'll continue suffering indefinitely if it means maintaining the belief that our suffering had purpose. But here's what I need you to understand. The fact that you've suffered doesn't mean the choice was right. The fact that you've sacrificed doesn't mean it was necessary. And the fact that you've convinced yourself there was no other option doesn't mean alternatives didn't exist. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is look back at the impossible decision you made and say, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I couldn't see clearly because I was operating from a place of fear and conditioning. Maybe the most loving thing would have been to share the burden instead of carrying it alone. That's the transformation that people like Itachi never get to experience because they're so locked into their narrative. They never give themselves permission to question the foundation of their identity. They never step back and ask, who would I be if I wasn't defined by my willingness to suffer? And that question, that's the key to everything. Because until you can separate your worth from your capacity for self-sacrifice, until you can see yourself as valuable independent of your utility, you're going to keep falling into the same pattern. Different circumstances, different people, same dynamic. Think about the relationships Itachi could never have. The friendships he couldn't maintain because he was always hiding. The mentorship he could have received if he'd been willing to admit he didn't have all the answers. The support systems he could have built if he'd let people see his humanity instead of just his strength. All of that was sacrificed not because it had to be, but because his psychological framework didn't allow for it. He was operating from a belief system that said, I must handle this alone because that's what strong people do. And that belief killed him just as surely as any physical disease. This is the hidden cost of the martyr complex that extends beyond the individual. When you refuse to be vulnerable, when you refuse to share your struggles, when you model this idea that real strength means suffering in silence, you're teaching everyone around you to do the same. You're perpetuating a toxic cycle where emotional repression gets passed down as a virtue. Kids grow up watching the strong people in their lives carry impossible burdens alone, and they internalize that as the right way to be. So they do the same thing when their turn comes. And the pattern continues generation after generation until someone finally says, this is destroying us and it needs to stop. But here's the thing about breaking that pattern. It requires you to fundamentally reimagine what strength looks like. It requires you to see asking for help not as weakness but as wisdom. It requires you to understand that sharing the burden doesn't make you less capable. It makes you more human. And for someone like Itachi who built his entire identity around solitary sacrifice, that reimagining would have felt impossible. It would have required dismantling everything he believed about himself and starting over from scratch. Drop a comment and tell me, I'm ready to question my own narrative. Because what comes next is going to challenge everything you think you know about the choices you've made and whether they were really as inevitable as you've been telling yourself. So here's the truth that's going to sit heavy with you. Itachi needed to believe he had no choice. Not because external circumstances actually eliminated all other options, but because that belief protected him from something far more terrifying, the possibility that he chose wrong. That he acted from a place of fear, conditioning, and emotional limitation rather than clear-headed necessity. That there might have been a path that didn't require him to erase himself completely, but he couldn't see it because his psychological framework was already wired for martyrdom before the crisis even began. Let me break down what actually happened in Itachi's mind during that critical moment. He was 13 years old, raised in a militant clan that valued duty above everything, trained as a weapon since childhood, praised for being emotionally detached and strategically brilliant. By the time he was faced with that impossible decision, he wasn't a neutral observer weighing options objectively. He was a kid who'd already been conditioned to see himself as a tool, who'd already internalized the belief that his personal feelings were irrelevant compared to the mission, who'd already accepted that his value came from his willingness to do what others couldn't or wouldn't do. So when the crisis hit, when he was told the clan was planning a coup that would lead to civil war, his brain didn't scan for collaborative solutions or alternative approaches. It went straight to, what's the most efficient way to neutralize this threat? Because that's what he'd been trained to do. That's the neural pathway that had been reinforced over and over throughout his entire childhood. And once he locked onto that solution, eliminate the threat completely, shoulder all the consequences alone, engineer a narrative that turns you into the villain so everyone else stays innocent. His brain flooded with certainty. This was the answer. This was the only way. But here's what's so psychologically complex about that moment. The certainty wasn't coming from an objective analysis of reality. It was coming from his subconscious need to maintain control and avoid the vulnerability of trusting anyone else with something this critical. If he'd brought others into the decision, if he'd sought counsel or collaboration, he would have had to face the possibility of things going differently than he planned. He would have had to surrender control. And for someone whose entire identity was built around being the person who handles everything perfectly, that loss of control felt more dangerous than any physical threat. This is where we need to talk about something that makes people really uncomfortable. Sometimes self-sacrifice is a form of emotional avoidance. It's not always the noble, selfless act it appears to be on the surface. Sometimes it's a way of escaping the messy, complicated work of actually connecting with people, of being vulnerable, of admitting you don't have all the answers. When you martyr yourself, you get to maintain the moral high ground. You get to be the one who suffered for others. You get to avoid the possibility of being seen as weak or uncertain or in need of help. And for someone like Itachi, who'd never been allowed to be weak or uncertain, who'd never experienced unconditional support that wasn't tied to his performance, that avoidance might have felt like the safer choice even if he couldn't articulate it that way. Now, this doesn't mean Itachi's sacrifice wasn't real or that his intentions weren't genuine. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that human motivation is always layered, always complex, always operating on multiple levels simultaneously. You can genuinely love someone and still be acting from a place of fear. You can genuinely want to protect people and still be running from your own vulnerability. These things aren't mutually exclusive. And the most psychologically sophisticated understanding of Itachi's choice acknowledges both realities at once. Yes, he was trying to prevent a catastrophe, and yes, he was also operating from deep psychological wounds that limited his ability to see alternatives. Here's where this connects to your life in ways you might not want to acknowledge. Every time you've taken on responsibility that wasn't yours, every time you've suffered in silence instead of asking for help, every time you've convinced yourself, there's no other way, you need to ask yourself honestly, was that really true? Or was that the story you told yourself to justify choosing the familiar pattern of solitary suffering over the terrifying unknown of shared burden and collaborative problem-solving? Because here's what I've noticed about people who consistently find themselves in situations where they feel like they have no choice but to sacrifice themselves. They're often creating those situations subconsciously. They're drawn to relationships and dynamics where they can play that role. They overlook opportunities for support because asking for support would require them to question their entire identity. They frame situations as more binary than they actually are because nuance is uncomfortable when you've built your self-worth around being the person who makes the hard calls alone. This is the pattern that traps you. Not the external circumstances, but the internal framework that interprets every challenge as another opportunity to prove your worth through suffering. And once you're locked into that framework, even when genuine alternatives exist, you can't see them. Your brain filters them out because they don't fit the narrative you've constructed about who you are and what you're supposed to do. Itachi's tragedy isn't just that he made a terrible choice at 13. His tragedy is that he never questioned it afterwards. He never allowed himself to consider that maybe, just maybe, there was another way. He spent his entire remaining life reinforcing the narrative that it was necessary, that it was the only option, that his suffering had meaning and purpose. And every time his brother grew stronger, every time the village remained stable, he took that as confirmation that he'd done the right thing. But confirmation bias works both ways. You can always find evidence to support the story you need to believe. What if things would have worked out differently but equally well through a different approach? What if bringing trusted allies into the situation would have prevented the coup without requiring mass murder and a lifetime of deception? What if being honest with Sasuke from the beginning would have created a different but equally meaningful path for his development? We'll never know because Itachi never explored those possibilities. He made a choice, committed to it completely, and then spent the rest of his life justifying it to himself. And this is what happens in real life too. You make a choice from a place of limited information and psychological conditioning. You tell yourself it was necessary. You build your identity around having made that choice. And then you spend years, sometimes decades, finding evidence that supports the decision while ignoring or dismissing anything that suggests there might have been another way. Because to acknowledge the alternatives would be to face the possibility that all that suffering was preventable. That you chose it even if unconsciously. That your martyrdom was as much about your psychological needs as it was about external necessity. Now here's where I need you to sit with some serious ambiguity, because this is where most people want a clean answer and there isn't one. Is self-sacrifice virtuous? Sometimes yes. Are there situations where taking on significant burden to protect others is genuinely the most loving thing you can do? Absolutely. But is it also true that self-sacrifice can be a trauma response, an avoidance mechanism, a way of maintaining control while appearing selfless? Yes, that's also true. And the really uncomfortable part is that both things can be happening at the same time in the same choice. Itachi's decision can be simultaneously an act of protection and an act of self-destruction. It can be simultaneously motivated by love and by fear. It can be simultaneously necessary given his limited options and completely avoidable if he'd had different psychological frameworks and support systems. Human behavior doesn't fit into neat categories where things are either noble or pathological. Most of the time, we're operating in this murky middle space where our best intentions are tangled up with our deepest wounds. And this is why the question of whether Itachi made the right choice is ultimately unanswerable and also kind of beside the point. The more important question is, what does his story reveal about how we make decisions when we're backed into corners? What does it show us about the beliefs we carry about our own responsibility and capacity? What does it teach us about the cost of trying to control outcomes through our own suffering? Because here's what I think the real lesson is. The belief that you have no choice is often the most dangerous belief you can hold. Not because it's always wrong, but because it shortcuts the difficult process of actually examining your options, your motivations, your fears. It gives you permission to act from conditioning instead of consciousness. It lets you bypass the hard questions about whether there's a way forward that doesn't require you to destroy yourself. And in your own life, when you're facing those moments where you feel trapped, where you feel like the only way forward is through your own suffering, that's exactly when you need to pause and ask, am I seeing this clearly? Or am I seeing it through the filter of beliefs I've carried since childhood about what I'm supposed to endure and who I'm supposed to be? Is there actually no other option, or am I just afraid of the vulnerability and uncertainty that would come with exploring alternatives? Those are uncomfortable questions. They don't have easy answers. And sometimes, even after asking them honestly, the difficult choice still ends up being the right one. But at least then you're choosing consciously instead of automatically. At least then you're acting from awareness instead of just reacting from conditioning. At least then you maintain the possibility of a different outcome instead of guaranteeing the same painful pattern plays out again. Drop a comment if this is making you rethink choices you've made. I'm questioning my certainty. Because there's one more layer to this that we haven't touched yet, and it's the piece that actually determines whether you stay trapped in this cycle or find a way out. So here's where we land after all of this. Breaking free from the cycle of sacrificial identity isn't about deciding that self-sacrifice is always wrong or that you should never take on difficult burdens for people you care about. It's about developing the awareness to distinguish between conscious choice and conditioned response. It's about asking yourself honestly whether you're acting from love or from fear, whether you're protecting others or avoiding your own vulnerability, whether you genuinely see no other option or whether you're just replaying the same script you've been running since you were too young to know there were other ways to be. And that work? That's not a one-time realization. It's an ongoing practice of catching yourself in those moments when you feel that familiar pull toward martyrdom and pausing long enough to ask, is this really necessary or is this just comfortable because it's what I know? Sometimes the answer will still be that yes, this sacrifice is worth making. But sometimes you'll catch yourself about to step into a pattern that doesn't serve anyone, least of all you. And in those moments you get to choose differently. You get to model a different kind of strength. The kind that admits limitation, asks for help, and believes that your well-being matters just as much as everyone else's. That's the transformation Itachi never got to experience. But you can. Look, if you made it all the way through this, that tells me something about you. It tells me you're not here for surface-level content or easy answers. You're here because you recognize something in this story that connects to your own life, and you're willing to sit with uncomfortable truths instead of just scrolling past them. That's rare, honestly. So if this type of psychological deep dive is what resonates with you, hit that subscribe button. This channel exists specifically for people who want to understand the hidden patterns driving their behavior, who are ready to question the narratives they've been carrying, and who can handle complexity without needing everything wrapped up in a neat little bow. And hey, drop a comment and let me know, this one hit different. I read every single one, and it genuinely helps me understand what's landing with you and what needs to be explored deeper in future content. Plus, when you engage like that, it tells the algorithm that this type of content matters, which means more people who need to hear this will actually find it. If this conversation created any kind of shift in how you're seeing yourself or the choices you've made, go ahead and hit that like button too. It's a small thing, but it makes a real difference in whether content like this reaches beyond just the people already here. And listen, there's a video right here that picks up on another angle of this whole dynamic. It goes into what happens when you finally try to break these patterns and why it feels so destabilizing at first. Click on that and keep this conversation going, because we're just getting started on unpacking all the ways we've been conditioned to see suffering as virtue. I'll see you there.